I'll turn it over to Joe.
Great. Well, thanks for all the intros, everybody. It's always helpful to kind of hear who's here and what's going on. We are thrilled to welcome Nick Zornes, the Development Service Director at the City of Los Altos as of May. Nick has been an environmental planner with the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality, helping build water infrastructure across the state. He's been a planner for the city of Dana Point, California, a planner for the city of Encinitas, where he was part of the team that obtained the city's first certified housing element in over 2 decades, overcoming several land use challenges and regulatory barriers. Most recently, he was planning manager for Riverside County. And prior to his work in the public sector, Nick worked as a planning consultant and within the construction industry as a project manager. Nick will be presenting some slides, and then we'll have time for a few excellent questions at the end. So if at that point you have an excellent question, please raise your virtual hand and David will moderate. I'd ask that everybody please mute at this point in time other than Nick, and please join me in welcoming Nick Zornes.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Very excited, one, to be here in the city of Los Altos. I've really enjoyed my almost 2 months, as it will be hit as of next week. So as I like to say, it's drinking from a fire hose and getting up to speed on things that have been going on in the city for quite some time. And obviously, this is what I will say is, our city's most vital and important guiding document. And is something that I'm really excited to, one, start helping educate the community on some of the misconceptions, misinformation, and things that float around during housing element season, as we call it in the profession. And really looking forward to helping bridge the gap of the understanding of what the housing element draft actually will do moving forward. But so just to kind of structure this particular presentation, it is, the Los Altos housing element, what it is, and why is it so important. But then I'm also going to touch on really the high level of what a housing element is, just the meat and potatoes of it, so that everyone has that information and understanding, especially when you do go to review the public review draft. Hopefully that'll help connect a little bit of the nexus for everyone. But then also really kind of starting to highlight some of the things that are actually going on in our actual draft. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. All right, so I'm actually going to share it as a PDF format just to make sure that everyone doesn't have any visual display issues. PowerPoint sometimes does that. So Joe, can you give me a thumbs up just to make sure you guys can see that? Okay, great. So as I said, yes, the Los Altos housing element. What is it? Why is it so important? Again, Nick Zornes, Development Services Director here at the city. Also, just to touch on that, the city, as a part of the recently adopted budget and news cycle that actually formally starts today, the Community Development Department is changing names to Development Services to be more in line with the actual services that the city does provide. So just so folks know that it's really just a naming thing, not necessarily services provided, changing anything like that. So just so no one gets confused, there's a little bit of a rebranding effort needing to still go on the city's website. So just so everyone's understanding that. Like I said, outline wise, we're going to just have a high level overview about what a housing element actually is. And then also what this 6th cycle. So we're in the 6th cycle right now, which is for our area of the state is 2023 to 2031. So an 8-year cycle. But then I'm going to, really go into what are our next steps actually here as a city and a jurisdiction, and then open it up to some questions, because I do know that a lot of folks have been hearing about the housing element for quite some time. Obviously, this isn't our first one, so some people should be somewhat familiar with it. And, then that way I can further help guide and also understand what some of the topics are here in this community. So with that, just the housing element overview. And diving right in is, and I'm going to kind of really use my slides to really, keep me organized, as well as something to relate back to for the folks enjoy or participating in this presentation. So a housing element, it is a required element. There are 7 required main elements in a housing element here in the state of California. Housing is one of them. Over the last several years, specifically the biggest strengthening, I would say, time frame has been over the last decade with the transition period and coming out of the last planning cycle from the 5th to the 6th cycle. So there have been a lot of recent state laws, but it's really been kind of strengthened over the last decade, I would say, in really creating a prescriptive requirement of cities to really memorialize what their housing elements actually do and how they do them. And so with that, the housing element provides policies and programs that will guide the city in our future growth. And that's specific to obviously housing. There's other elements, obviously, like land use, traffic, and those tackle those specific issues. But this one is specific to our actual housing stock. A part of the actual housing element is we are given and assigned an allocation, RENA, which I will talk about in more depth in future slides, that is essentially our quantified number of what we are required to account for and plan for. I will touch on this a little bit later, is we're not required to build them as a jurisdiction, but we are required to zone for them and create the potential capacity for them to be built. And then from that is we, as a part of the housing element, it does require review by the state. There, in years past, 3rd, 4th cycle, yes, they did review it, but there wasn't as much in-depth analysis from the state level. That has since changed in the last several years with the 5th and 6th cycle. So the Housing and Community Development Department for the state of California, HCD, is what you'll hear often in public hearings and community workshops. They are the folks that ultimately have to review whatever we do as a local jurisdiction and tell us if it is acceptable with the way state law has created prescriptive requirements for each jurisdiction. Going into now, why are housing elements updated? This helps to ensure that a city will maintain compliance with housing law. And one of the things that has now really started being just the way to have the conversation and really have that being understood at the local jurisdictions is planners and community development practitioners like myself are using just the straightforward term as this is a contract with the state of California telling them that we will do what is also in the state laws, which we would be held and responsible to do anyways, but it's our local acknowledgement that we will do the detailed programs and honoring specific laws that a lot of times have fallen off the books in certain jurisdictions, or they get away from some of the specific requirements that the state does have already in place. Additionally, this does, having an adopted and certified housing element does make the city eligible for grants. The city in recent years has not gone after or obtained certain grants that we could have. But moving forward, we do need to really explore that with a lot of the specific needs and desires that the community has for specific planning initiatives in order to be able to better fund those. And this housing element will specifically allow for us to be eligible for a lot of the grants that will be available from the state in future years. Additionally, a housing element, we need to update it because we need to demonstrate that we have the ability to have the capacity and the areas that will allow for the zoning for the housing growth for our RENA allocation, essentially, which again, I'll draw that nexus in future slides. And then also one of the big things is our community and our population changes. And that's significant to the process of a housing element update. It is important for us to be able to engage the community further throughout the planning cycle, and specifically at the end of a planning cycle. For just noteworthy reasons is one of the reasons why a housing element is prescriptively required to be updated every 8 years is so that we are obviously, yes, meeting the housing needs and demands of the growth of our communities, as well as, obviously we're in a housing crisis, as the state terms it, in regards to not having enough to house the folks that we have already here and the future folks that we will have in the state of California. But this is typical for jurisdictions to update their entire general plans. However, a lot of jurisdictions don't, because it is a very entailed process. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money, a lot of resources in general. So what the state has done is required the housing element, because it is what they decided that it is the most important element of them all, has to be updated on this cycle so that we are not falling behind as we have in so many other jurisdictions. And so that's why we do arrive at why housing elements specifically are updated as a standalone element. So what's in a housing element? I really do just want to kind of touch on this. It is the population and the housing of the profile in our city. Obviously, we kind of know it loosely, but it really does more of an in-depth analysis that does help us actually understand what we currently have and what obviously we need to have. And so the evaluation of housing constraints, though, that's a big thing as well. That looks at our existing development standards, our existing internal processes and policies that potentially create an impact or barrier to the creation of housing. And that obviously ties into the programs and policies, like I mentioned. So those are very indicative of constraints. It can be both ways. Programs and policies can be ones that help alleviate the constraints, but some of the constraints actually might be some of our existing and outdated practices. And then obviously the big one is an analysis of sites and what's appropriate for housing. What are some of our vacant sites? Obviously, we're a built-out jurisdiction, so we don't have as many as some of the other jurisdictions that are on the outskirts of the county areas. So for us, we have to look at some of our existing zoning that allows for housing now or doesn't, and would require a rezone program to allow for housing as an option. And so that's a really big thing. The sites analysis is it's a fundamental and large part of the document. And ultimately, and what I put as our in bold at the bottom of this is goals, policies, and programs, and quantifiable objectives. That is what I say meat and potatoes, and something that really is what we're saying to the state. This is what we know we have to do. These are the things that we should do, and these are the things that we need to do in regards to state law, our community, and the benefits inevitably that it will afford us. One of the things, though, that I will point out is that it's a big shift from the 5th to 6th cycle is the quantified objectives and specific timelines. HCD in the state of California has really started becoming very prescriptive in each jurisdiction's housing element to actually have identifiable objectives as well as realistic timelines. Realistic, though, means meeting the needs of what these programs are actually doing, not realistic in, oh, we just don't have enough staff to do that this year, we need to push it off until the 6th year in the planning cycle. That doesn't cut the mustard, as they say, and ultimately is something that always ends up coming back from HCD as a pretty hard-hitting comment, is that our deadlines need to be more realistic and in line with actually providing the benefit of the program itself. So that's something when you all eventually see our draft, there you'll see sliding due dates and target dates for completion, because we have to do certain ones by certain dates, no matter what, that's state law. And then there's other ones that are really what can we get done in this amount of time, but also based on kind of the moving parts of all the other programs. So moving on to RENA, everyone's probably favorite topic, regional housing needs assessment. You also hear the word allocation used. So a lot of times people say that or think that it's the regional housing needs allocation. It's actually assessment. The allocation is what comes from your RENA or what's prescribed in RENA processes with the Council of Governments. We are in ABAG, which is our local Council of Governments for our region. And ABAG is the group that helps create our region-wide allocation after we have our assessments throughout the region, essentially. And so RENA, what it does is it helps to quantify the needs of housing within each jurisdiction. And so you will, if you Google, and it's quite the rabbit hole to go down, but in full transparency, every COG does it differently because there is different what they call methodologies that can be created. Obviously, our needs and methodologies, because the way that our region has developed, the needs of our communities are different. The way that we travel, the way that housing stock is developed, it's different than Southern California. I have worked in two different, what they call the COGs, Council of Governments, SANDAG being the San Diego region, and SCAG being actually the state's largest COG, which is Southern California Council of Governments. And that area, they have totally different methodologies from themselves, even though they butt right up to each other, and definitely very different than ABAG. So just so folks know, one of the things is you really do need to make sure if you ever do kind of go down the RENA rabbit hole, as I like to say, you need to make sure you're looking at what ABAG has done and not what other Council of Governments have done, because their methodologies are fundamentally completely different. And then what RENA also really does, and it's at the root of it, it's based on the future growth in population for employment and housing households. And so that's really kind of what RENA kind of fully encompasses, just as a high level. Specific, just as a kind of a disclosure component, because our housing element is out on the streets for everyone to truly see what's been compiled up until this point over the last almost year of work that's been going on in the document. These are our numbers that are displayed on the screen. The city of Los Altos RENA allocation is 1,958 units. So essentially, for conversation purposes, 2,000 units. Of that, our allocation does come with 4 specific income categories, and that is based off of AMI, the median income of the area. And that's something that is figured out annually. So it does change. It's actually not just a part of the planning period, which is the 8 years. The AMI can change year to year, and that's published at the first quarter of every year. And so one year it could go up what the affordable rate is for rent or for sale, but these are still the 4 categories that are required in our RENA. There is another one it's not allocated into what we have to accommodate for, which is the extremely low income category. If we were to build extremely low affordable units, we do get credit for those. However, it's not one of them that they explicitly put onto our RENA allocation. So just to quickly go over, it's very low income, moderate income, and above moderate income. As it's displayed here, that means a specific percentage amount of the area median income. So again, it's a mathematical equation. Just so that I don't go too far into the depth of it, if anybody has specific questions about the specific income categories, we definitely reach out to me and we can have a conversation because that sometimes a lot of people have very specific questions on. So I'll save that for another day, another conversation for us and the residents. So what is the housing element sites inventory? This identifies the capacity that can accommodate for our RENA allocation. So meaning those 2,000 units that we have been allocated from ABAG and by proxy, the state of California, we have to identify sites in the city that accommodate for those housing numbers. And that's where we then have to start finding sites. So whether or not we have vacant or whether or not we have developed ones that might be ripe for redevelopment. Something that is, noteworthy to say is the property owners are not required to build the projected numbers or the affordability units identified explicitly. It's just what we're saying, what we think as a city after doing some in-depth analysis and market research is that that's what those particular sites could actually accommodate and hopefully should accommodate. Ultimately, we can't control exactly what applications the city does receive in. That's why it's an ongoing monitoring process throughout the entire planning cycle to kind of play what I say is planning Tetris. Okay, well, if this is changing in this one, how do we accommodate it here? There's also other state laws that do require us to consistently continue to monitor that, as well as hold ourselves accountable, where if we were to fall under certain numbers or capacity, we then have to provide additional sites in order to be able to have that. Also, as a part of the sites inventory is you are required to have what's called a buffer. And that's just accommodating for some extra housing units on top of the 2,000 essentially, in order to make sure that we are having some of that extra capacity where if a development were to come in at not the projected amount that the city thinks we can get on there and it's a lower amount, then we're able to make sure that we're still meeting that that criteria and actually having the overall capacity. And as a part of this, the city with the sites inventory helps to encourage and facilitate the production of the housing for the income levels identified. And that's something that we do through the programs and policies that's in the housing element. So kind of really, like I said, this is what I, as a, this being my fourth housing element in the last 3 years, this is what I find to be the meat and potatoes of the document in regards to things that we have to do moving forward after adoption and certification, and have this be our living, breathing, guiding document for the city. And that's the goals, policies, and programs section of the document. What that section does, it's pretty much towards the beginning when you look at our draft. It's our specific action items and steps that the city is going to take in order to implement this housing element. That's really important, like I mentioned previous slides ago, is to have those quantifiable objectives, the deliverable dates to the state. That's essentially, like I mentioned at the very beginning, it's our contract with the state of California outlining what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, and when we're going to do it. So specific requirements are the timeframes for implementation, identify the responsible agencies or officials. For our particular jurisdiction, I will just say it's pretty much my department as the lead in regards to doing the implementation or development of the programs that are identified in the document. However, that doesn't mean that I won't have to pull in other departments in the city or even collaborations with other outside entities in order to get some of these programs to be successful. We don't want to just create programs or new codes or reinvent codes if they're not going to work. So we want them to be successful. So as needed, we will have to pull in other folks as well. And what it does is it describes our roles, responsibilities, provides those measurable outcomes, and also potentially does identify or provide future funding sources in order to be able to develop and implement the actual programs themselves. To touch on, I'm specifically going to have this just as a disclosure again for what we actually have done over the course of the housing element development over this last, almost year is our outreach. And the reason why I really want to make sure that we all know is the city has done a pretty robust and good job of doing outreach. Sometimes there can be more, sometimes there can be less. It really is on a case-by-case basis and specific to each jurisdiction about what is going to be the quote unquote term that is always used is providing meaningful engagement. That is the two-word term that every housing element is reviewed against when it comes to the outreach component is, did we do meaningful engagement to the public? And so that's really where we have to draw on. I mean, we are in Silicon Valley. It is a very tech-friendly city. So a dedicated website was obviously something that needed to be done, so that everything was accessible at the fingertips of a lot of folks throughout the city. Pop-up events is also something that you want to be able to make sure that we end up getting into certain parts and sectors of the community that might not, gravitate towards looking at something citywide on the city's website. So doing that to kind of put that out there. Virtual meetings, there was 30 virtual meetings actually held over the last year with small groups. So attendees from anything as small as 2 to 15. Double page ads obviously in the town crier have happened. The housing newsletter, I'm sure a lot of you folks, obviously, if you're watching this presentation, you're probably interested and signed up for the newsletter. But last time we checked, it was 150 persons that were signed up for the newsletter. We did community workshops that had, anywhere between 50 people and more, and also spent specifically direct mailer flyers as well. I'm sure a lot of folks have seen around the city multiple banners that actually say be a part of essentially the shaping the housing element and what we're actually doing. Those were posted on city buildings and properties where you typically see banners. They did come down for a 2-week period for a couple of the sponsored programs that are in the city, but they either are back up or going back up in all of the locations that they originally posted at to be able to have that further kind of disclosure as well as engagement of the community so that everyone has somewhat of an opportunity to potentially know that something's going on and reach out to the city or do their own research. But again, fundamental is meaningful engagement, so it can be different everywhere. And so where are we at today? Because we kind of have covered the majority of what a housing element is, at least from a high level perspective, and also kind of where and what we have specifics to our housing element in regards to the RENA allocation, which is obviously huge, and obviously our meaningful engagement of our outreach. The housing element, as I think everyone knows, and we did mention, thank you, Ms. Paulson, for notating that it is on a public review draft when you were doing your introduction, is on June 22nd, we did release the housing element for a public review draft. The sub bullet for this one is I do want to make sure that, I obviously clarify and define what it is. The state requires a 30-day comment period. And so that is what we are in right now, is the formal 30-day comment period. We have not had anything like that up until this point because you don't do it until you have your draft. But you do all these outreach and things beforehand that end up creating what we have as a draft. And now it's time for the community to engage and dig into the devil in the details of the actual document, see what was included. If there weren't things that were included that were notated, that's the opportunity for the community to memorialize and public comment in writing, hopefully just to be able to truly help make sure that things are reanalyzed or included after this 30-day comment period. Or obviously what we're also doing, which I'm segueing now into the July 7th Planning Commission presentation of the draft. So next week on Thursday, the Planning Commission will discuss this item. They will receive an update of the draft from the last time that they did see some preliminary, not document, but a preliminary overview of where we're at right now, which the last time was on April 26th. So it's been, a little bit of time where we had to get that document completed. And so they will now see a comprehensive presentation of what the draft actually is and where we're at. That opportunity will give the public the ability to provide testimony and public comment for the actual draft, and then also provide the opportunity for the Planning Commission to have discussion on the item and memorialize some of their comments as a commission. They will not be making a specific recommendation at this time because that's not what the state law requires for this particular part of the process. This is really more just a disclosure and saying this is where we're at, this is what we have, this is what we're doing, and setting the stage for the rest of the process, which is fairly prescriptive. After that, the next meeting, same thing, will be going to the city council for that same public testimony and discussion. However, the city council is going to be directing staff to send the draft housing element to HCD. They will not be providing us specific direction on how to do it, because it's a pretty prescriptive process. So we will have that direction provided, that at the close of the public comment period, that we will then submit that to HCD for their initial review, which is 90 days. Somewhat jumped ahead of myself is because after the close of the public comment period, which closes on July 24th, which is actually on a weekend. So we're actually doing 32 days, not 30, because of the way that the dates fall, is we then have 10 business days. So that obviously doesn't account for weekends and doesn't account for holidays. So it will be 2 full working weeks, essentially, for the city and the consultant to consider and incorporate comments received. So those will be comments that are received by or from the city council, from the planning commission, and from the public. That's why I said, if people can have the ability to do written correspondence, that's great, so that we can actually really ensure that nothing is missed or overlooked in the process. Obviously, you can do both. That's even better, to do public comment at one of the meetings on the 7th or the 12th. But written comments is always a really great way and avenue that I think helps organize the future build back in of the comments during that 10-day period, and also future throughout the rest of the actual development of the draft. After that 10 days, which is just a minimum, I'm going to be totally transparent. That's a really quick turnaround, especially in a city that's as engaged as ours. And I say that as that I think that's a good thing, that we have a very engaged citizen basis, as well as just community in general. However, more comments means more analysis. So that means it might take us more than 10 business days to integrate and fold back in some comments before we send that to HCD. Once we have folded those in for, like I said, a minimum of 10 business days, we then will submit that to HCD for their first round of review. It is a 90-day maximum. The reason why I say maximum is that they do not have the ability to extend that, like some other state agencies do have the flexibility of sending a letter of, we need more time. They do not. However, I will tell, like I said, this is my 4th housing element. HCD does not get reviews done quicker than their prescribed amount of time. ABAG, our specific region where everyone has the same due date, we have over 100 jurisdictions that will be submitting essentially right around the same time. So a lot of folks are in the same boat that we're in right now. Some people might be submitting, right this second. Some people are going to be submitting maybe a month after us. And maybe some folks have already submitted even earlier than us. So they're very busy, and they also have other regions that they are still reviewing, even though their statutory due dates are long past now. So just so everyone knows, we're not going to get comments back earlier. It never happens. And that's just because of the level of review, as well as how impacted that particular state level agency is. From there, we get back comments from HCD after 90 days. So that's going to be probably put us into November that we receive a comment letter from them. From there, we have to revise the draft housing element based on comments received. based on comments received from HCD, but also from our public as well. So that's also, again, a very big, task to undertake. And so I can't really speak to exactly how long that part will take. It really depends on what comments we get from HCD. From there, just as noteworthy, so some folks know, there's not really a big public comment period window. However, that's why I tell people the public comment period, although the formal 30 days closes on the 24th, public comments are received and held and provided as a part of our document of the draft element the entire way through. Public participation is the most important crucial part of the entire process of developing this document. But with that said, is once we actually do have a revised draft after we receive HCD's comments, the legal requirement for us is posting the document online for 7 calendar days for public review prior to a resubmission to HCD. So that is where you would see then an updated public review draft of a formal updated draft. However, there will be subsequent hearings potentially or discussion items that the city council could hear depending on what items we are given as a part of our comment letter from HCD. That's just want everyone to know so that they kind of are familiar with what the particular process will be moving forward. And then after that 7 calendar days of a revised draft disclosed to the public, we then resubmit to HCD for review again. Subsequent reviews after the first review from HCD go from 90 days to 60 days. So it does go down slightly, but still not great. That's 2 solid months of a waiting period. So that obviously does bring us to, the start of next year. So that's a very, a lot of work to do in actually a small amount of time, given that 5 months gets eaten away at just reviews by the state. So we will be working as expeditiously as possible to be able to revise and create the most ideal draft that will satisfy the requirements of state law, but the needs of our community, which is really the root of the document. Like I kind of mentioned, this is something that was on the April 26th joint session meeting with City Council and Planning Commission. I've though moved where we're at. We previously were in the April kind of PC study session number 2. So we've now moved forward. We are in the public review process. So like I said and outlined for you on the previous slide, this is just kind of a visual representation of where we're at and where we're going. So obviously for you folks to be able to reference after this, because this PDF will be shared with you after this meeting. And with that, though, that does bring me to the end of my presentation component in order to be able to hopefully answer some questions, or even maybe able to just take some notes so that I know what I need to start addressing moving forward in the coming weeks and months of this housing element.
Nick, thanks very much for a great presentation. We're going to start the Q&A right now. If you could at first limit your questions to 1 question so that everybody gets a chance. And then, of course, I'll go around again and pick up people for a second round, time permitting. Please remember to use the go to the reactions button on your Zoom and, raise your virtual hand. First hand up, and it'll be first come, first serve. I don't see, people are probably formulating their questions.
There are already 3 hands up.
That's what, maybe it's the view. They're not.
Why don't we, Nick, why don't we have you stop sharing the slides?
Yeah,
and then now David should be able to see all the hands. Gary was first if we want to get going with Gary.
Gary Hedden.
Thanks, Nick, for the presentation. Lots of numbers and dates. But what I didn't see was kind of the overarching vision, what we're trying to accomplish here that's good for the city. For me, it's creating a walkable, bikeable neighborhoods where you don't have to get into a car to get what you need. It's also an opportunity to, because they're smaller clusters of housing, it's a chance to get to know your neighbors. And if it's around commercial business districts, it's good for the local businesses. So, when I posed that same point to Joe Simidian, what he said was, Gary, you've got to answer the question, what's in it for me? That's how you sell this to the residents. And so what are the benefits? What's your vision, Nick?
I mean, the overarching benefits of a well-designed housing element is one, that it actually meets the needs of the residents and the population. There are some folks that aren't residents by virtue of the fact that there isn't housing that is obtainable and affordable in this community for certain sectors of the population. That's what housing elements are designed to do, is to be able to provide housing options and stock in a community that allows for everyone to be able to live within the jurisdiction, essentially, and it not be just a cluster of a specific income category. That's also why specifically there have been a breakdown of 4 specific income categories that we do have to zone and account for as a part of our inventory, and as well as just as a part of the entire document. What I really think is that it gives additional options to current residents as well as future residents in our housing stock. And it actually allows for some folks, I'm sure if we actually did a really robust analysis, we probably have people traveling in from one of the things that you just mentioned, Gary, is having a livable, walkable, bikeable community. Some people aren't going to be able to bike to work with where they live right now and work in our city. We do have service industry folks, and I guarantee you they probably do not live in our city. And this will help open the door to be able to provide housing options for those folks that are needed positions, jobs in our community, because otherwise we won't have businesses here, providing the services and conveniences that we have. And so I think that's really the overarching and fundamental thing that this housing element, as well as all housing elements, can help achieve.
Thank you.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for the presentation. Question I have is I've heard, I don't know the details, that if the city has an approved housing element and then fails to make progress in certain areas, the state essentially comes in and does it for us. Is that true? And what are some key places where there are such triggers that cause us to lose control of our housing?
So background in the legislative cycle for 2020 and 2021, the state legislature did approve multiple bills that increased further HCD's purview as well as their ability to enforce. They actually now have an enforcement unit. That is actually what it is titled. It is headed by some former housing element reviewers that I actually have been reviewed against with my previous and certified housing elements. So they know exactly what they're doing in housing law compliance. With that being said, not having a certified or minimum an adopted housing element puts you into enforcement territory instantly. However, all jurisdictions are always going to be in enforcement territory in regards to if you are not, what you kind of alluded to is we create these programs, but they have to be implementable programs. So we can't just create what housing elements used to be prior to late adopted 5th cycle and the current 6th cycle. So meaning definitely anything before the 5th cycle was really kind of a little bit of a fluffy document, in my opinion. These documents are not able to be fluff anymore. They have to be something that actually can be implemented in a community. If you are not implementing them, you very well will get a notice of violation from HCD, which what you kind of alluded to is, yes, HCD does have enforcement capabilities now where they used to have to use the Attorney General's office to actually really come down and take you to court. That process isn't necessarily just having to go to a courthouse anymore to actually get things done and going. So really what it actually does is it gives HCD the ability now to actually come in if they needed to and potentially reduce, restrict, or remove your land use authority. They have not historically really done it to the extreme, but they do have the capabilities to do it. The city of Encinitas, where I previously obtained 2 certified housing elements, 5th and 6th cycle, was threatened with that multiple times and received multiple notice of violations because of some of the issues that were going on in the jurisdiction. The city of Huntington Beach was also another jurisdiction that was in the same boat at the same time that was made an example of by the state of California. So it is very real. It does happen. And it really can impact overall what the community does or does not want. Is it can be to the extreme level where we really do have no control over land use if we are not meeting these requirements that are outlined in our housing element.
Thanks, Nick. Roy Lave.
Well, Nick, yeah, thanks for the talk and thanks for the plan. It's an amazing document. So could you say something about the sites that are identified? Will they be rezoned? Will they be rezoned in spite of what the owner thinks? Will they be rezoned in cooperation with the owner? Will they have dual zoning? What's the next step for those sites?
So there is fundamentally 2 ways of doing it. The city of Encinitas, we did it where you kind of we don't do dual zoning in regards to that. There used to be something considered dual zoning, but it's a land use law nightmare to do true dual zoning. But what you can do now is an overlay, which means that the underlying zone can exist until the overlay zoning is taken into effect by the virtue of entitlements or the build out of the development. So there is that mechanism to be able to potentially do that. However, it does slow down the process potentially to have it as an overlay depending on the environmental analysis that you do or don't do. Every jurisdiction does it a little bit differently if they do an overlay. I would not recommend doing an overlay just because it does slow down the process and potentially impediments to the creation of future housing on those sites. So doing the full-blown rezone or environmental analysis does help to streamline it in the regards to what we truly ultimately need to do in the overall process. Collaboration and concurrence is obviously ideal. If you do look up in technical assistance guidance documents on HCD's website, property owners don't explicitly have to, have buy-in to say, oh yeah, we want to rezone or we are rezoning. It can be something that the city proposes in order to be able to account for our housing capacity needs. However, if we do obviously have an egregious property owner or knowledge that there's obviously no way in heck that it's going to get developed, that is obviously something as a city that we need to consider and probably remove that from an inventory potentially. I say that just because the inventory list that we have, we don't have that generous of a buffer, so I don't want to kind of throw that carrot out there that that's an option for the stuff that we have. However, we obviously do need to take that into account. But what I would say to anybody is if there's identifiable or issues with specific things on the inventory as a part of a way for us to be able to continue moving this bus forward, help us have alternatives. We can't just take everything off the list, which is what most jurisdictions always want to say and combat. Take this site off because of this, take that one off because of this. Okay, that's fine. What's the alternative then? What's the option to then replace the housing stock capacity that we were initially guaranteeing, or not guaranteeing, but accounting for? And so that's that trade-off, and that's what we have to be cognizant of moving forward with this element.
Thanks. Ann Paulson. Unmute.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about the city's attitude toward the parking plazas. So the parking plazas are listed for 138 units of housing. And it's sort of distributed among all of them, which everyone knows that's not going to happen. Obviously, we're not going to develop all 9 parking plazas for housing, but we own these, so we don't have the excuse that, oh, the owner doesn't want to develop. If we say they're going to be developed, we can develop them. So are we then going to commit to those 138 units of housing?
Yes and no, but it also takes the will and desire of a private developer, even if it's a non-private or a nonprofit housing developer, to develop them in what they want to develop. So, because we won full transparency, and I think everyone knows the city does not have the money to actually build the actual structures and units themselves. So obviously, it would have to be somewhat in a collaborative process with some type of a developer, profit or nonprofit. But the fact that we do own land that potentially could be utilized for our housing stock, we then can control development standards as well as density requirements on those a lot better than we can with a privately owned lot with standards that are already memorialized. And so that's where by virtue of a development agreement, the lease or sale of land, you can have that all wrapped into certain things where we know what units we're getting out of the process on the front end versus kind of what we're stuck with in regards to how development takes place with the private market is it's at the will and desire of what the developers actually want to see. So I don't want to say that all of them are going to get developed because that's a pretty ostentatious kind of thing to take, 9 different parking lots and turn them into that. But it's what's identified in the housing element in the program. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but the program that speaks to parking plazas is that we will essentially engage or allow for and facilitate the redevelopment of at least one of our city parking lots. And essentially that is then, your test case, in my opinion, is to see how that one functionally does. You don't want to do all of them at the same time. You can build upon what actually works and some of the critical pitfalls of what we need to include in other ones, if that was to be something to be built upon for other of the plazas. So yes and no, and it's kind of, I think we also have to see what the temperament is of the market that would want to also work collaboratively with the city on redevelopment of any potentially city-owned land.
Thanks, Nick. I just wanted to mention that it's 9:30. And
I can go over a little bit if people have questions. I can't go on forever, but I can go on a little bit longer just to answer some more.
That would be great. And I'm just acknowledging that if some folks might have to leave, but if you can stay, that would be great. Also, a couple of really quick announcements so we catch everybody. In deference to summer vacations, there will not be an LACC event 2 weeks from today on July 15th. And steering committee is organizing something for the 29th. If you'd like to be added to the LACC mailing list, that would be great. If you're not already on it, please send an email to info@losaltoscommunitycoalition.org. And it's posted in the chat for your convenience. And I want to thank, as always, the Los Altos Mountain View Community Foundation for providing LACC with financial and in-kind support. Next question is from Jim Fenton.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to ask about residential parking. People in Los Altos tend to like having cars, and I noticed that especially in areas where there's a density, in some developments where there's a density bonus, the required parking is reduced. What can we do in order to minimize the overflow impact of that, especially on streets like, I mean, some of these developments are on El Camino, and there's discussion about removing parking on El Camino pretty much entirely. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
As it relates to density bonus, I just want to have candor when I say it. There is nothing we can do when it comes to the parking ratios that are prescribed in the government code, which is 65915, for specifically density bonus. It is upon their request. If they want the ratios that are prescribed within density bonus law, we do not have flexibility to review that specifically, condition that with alternatives. If they meet the requirements of density bonus law, we have to honor the request or whatever provided parking that they provide. So they can provide the minimum. A lot of developers, I will say, when they even are doing state density bonus, I mean, I have not worked in a city like San Francisco or LA proper for that conversation. Those folks probably do capitalize on the fact that they can, get away with having less vehicle parking. And that's just by virtue of the fact that they have very livable, walkable cities, as well as public transportation, literally right outside probably their door to the community that they're building. However, in jurisdictions that I have worked that exercise density bonus, more often than not, they are providing at least the minimum, if not even a few extra to some degree. And that is by virtue of it's market driven as well, because especially for rent and for purchase, the fewer units that parking stalls that you have, a lot of times ends up affecting, rentability or the potential sale of a property. So there's that. We do though have, we do have the ECR. So, and that you're 100% right is that there's reduction of parking ratios, elimination of parking, which is somewhat in a collaborative approach, considering that ECR is a main roadway for 3 big jurisdictions, Los Altos, Palo Alto, and Mountain View, all within a little small area. So we collaboratively have to work on ECR parking and traffic patterns in general. It's not just one, it's a multi-jurisdictional and agency solution, and also impacts. So the reduction in overflow, or the reduction, we can't really do anything about the ratios when it comes to a state density bonus law request. The overflow onto streets and parking, that does then come to what I say are just best practices in regards to having traffic management plans. Sometimes you can have that as a part of a project specific, requirements depending on certain particulars of the area, and things of that nature, but also it does require the city to have more potentially an engaged hand in the overview and oversight of parking programs, whether or not it's permitted street parking, where you have to have a city permit for that. I'm not saying we're doing that or need to do that for certain areas, but that's an alternative, or a thing to actually look into where it does help control that particular potential impact.
Nick, Joe Air.
Thank you for the presentation. I was looking at the inventory of properties on the spreadsheet, and the vast majority, other than the downtown parking plazas, the vast majority of them are commercial or private or religious, properties. Supermarkets, stores, restaurants, medical, dental offices, churches, banks, and undeveloped private parcels. I just don't understand how we could even begin to think that those are all going to have housing, and the state could enforce those to be housing. Are you going to use eminent domain, or is there going to be like this huge bucket of cash for which we could buy properties? It just seems like a lot of it's kind of a, a shell game where we're proposing all these properties, just like all the other cities are, that are really unreasonable to develop. So I don't understand how this is realistically being proposed.
So one thing though that is important to note, and it's something I just didn't want to go down the rabbit hole in my presentation so that I could obviously help cover a lot of the misinterpretations or misunderstandings just about fundamental basics about a housing element. In regards to ultimately rezones and sites that are identified, like you mentioned, the OA district, things that don't currently allow residential uses in the actual district themselves, it does not mean that we will rezone them to being, and that's why it's not prescriptive to say that in the housing element program. So I know some people probably are thinking, oh, well, it says this and it's kind of, a blanket statement, but we also don't want to say, yeah, we're going to rezone the OA to R1. You don't want to do that. That you're now effectively changing the entire potential of the site. But with the development of an actual program and the actual implementing ordinances that are required to do zone changes, to do changes of the development standards, it's not that we are going to do away with the OA component of those particular sites. It's that we're going to integrate the ability to develop housing on that site as well. I foresee us, because we don't have that much commercial type properties throughout the city. We have a fair amount, but we don't have, we're not robust in regards to having, huge districts that are, for commercial type uses. So it's the integration of the housing to the existing type of uses that are there right now. So that means creating essentially effectively mixed use districts, but it's not just blanket mixed use that you just say, oh yeah, it's mixed use with commercial and housing. It's an OA mixed use in regards to, we have the foundational of that. We have OA as the office and administrative uses that have been longstanding uses in the community and specifically on those properties, with the integration of housing, versus where you do like a CT zone, which is the ECR for the majority, which is commercial thoroughfare. And that zone is, yes, very much actual commercial type, Whole Foods, for example, bigger type establishments in regards to what the commercial use actually is and operational standards. And then, yes, multifamily. So that's truly more of a mixed use zone in the traditional standards. So the integration of housing, it's providing the option and flexibility to be able to meet the housing needs of the city with certain districts that we have existing, and blending the two together is kind of where I envision it, where it probably should go in the future. In regards to like the land that you mentioned, the PCF zone, so religious institutions and things of that nature, there was recent state law that essentially said that this is, that these can be used for housing stock and production just by virtue of the passive type use that they are. And so it's just the ability, and I will say from working in a previous jurisdiction, that they had, vacant land or underutilized parking space area, or, a back, field or something that they ended up, it wasn't a lot, which is kind of what we've identified on our religious facilities, is that you can put some type of housing and parishioners or the actual clergy staff, depending on the type of religious institution it is, that it provides that housing stock option for folks that actually need it. And so it's just creating that ability to zone for it. A lot of times the market will dictate it, though. We're not buying properties. We don't have the money to buy the properties. We don't have the money to build the units. We're also not expected to do either of those two things. What we are expected to do as a jurisdiction is to be able to remove any development or housing impediments that reduces or limits the ability to effectively build housing on any of the sites that are identified. And it still will be a lot of it market driven on what the sites actually can build and the the taste for that type of development by either landowners or potential prospective developers that can work in collaboration with property owners.
Thanks for the comprehensive answer, Nick, and obviously a very important question. We're going to take two more. Marie is next up.
Thank
Marie.
you. Thanks, Nick, for the great presentation and everybody for the very good questions. I've learned a lot this morning. My question to you, Nick, is that given that this is a draft, what we have in front of us now, a draft element, and that you have been successful in getting other elements approved by HCD, what changes to the draft do you think are needed at this point so that we can get approved by the state?
In full disclosure, I will say every reviewer is a little different from the state agency at HCD. With that being said, I've had reviewers in the past, some that are very data focused in regards to the sites analysis and inventory. And then I've had others that are very focused specifically on the deliverables within the program's goals and policies section. Ultimately, we will get comments on everything. However, it's kind of luck of the draw. You just have some folks that are more specific in regards to what their specialty essentially is. So you might get some more prescriptive or hard-hitting comments on certain sections versus others. That's why I don't think, you can kind of look at what other jurisdictions are getting in comments and feedback and really know exactly what to expect or not. Obviously, if it was possible to have a state standard housing element that every city just had to adopt, kind of like what most jurisdictions do with the building code, they would have done that years ago. It's specific to our jurisdiction because things of our geographical location, the topography in regards to just even physical land area, but then it's also our population, our income levels, the needs of the community, the employment that we have in the community. So there's all those things that get factored into it that can potentially, or why it's so different in every jurisdiction. I would not be surprised if we end up needing to add additional sites to our inventory potentially, because sometimes through HCD's analysis, they say remove a particular site because they don't believe that it is consistent with the technical guidance that they provided for their site inventory. I think the consultants have done a good job of identifying what we have to work with in this community and have provided enough of a nexus to be able to hopefully withstand HCD's review for the sites that we do have identified. However, it's not uncommon for additional sites to be or needing to be added after the initial review. Additionally, and that's also, that's increase of a buffer sometimes as well. So that's also a lot of it. One of the big things that I think, a lot of jurisdictions are still grappling with is affirmatively furthering fair housing. So FFH is what you can pretty much guarantee is going to be in every comment letter. And that's because HCD pretty much just came out with their technical guidance document for that particular requirement. And it hasn't been long-standing in regards to application or development. And it's also very jurisdiction specific. So that's always kind of, I would say, a zinger in every jurisdiction. And that's really, the big thing that a lot of folks just have to kind of really heed the comments from HCD and then determine how we can better affirmatively further fair housing for our jurisdiction.
Thanks, Nick. And last question from Joe Beninato.
Thank you, Nick. It's really great information. And I'm glad, the more we talk about this, the more people can get educated about the various ins and outs. You mentioned working on 4 housing elements, which is amazing experience. I'd imagine some of those were approved and some were not. What separates the housing elements that get approved from the ones that are not, and what lessons from that can we apply to our approach to make sure that we do get approved?
Candor and just full transparency is trying to argue with HCD on their findings that they provide in their comment letters. I mean, this has been my profession, specifically to planning, for, over a decade, and here in California, last 6 years. So I've never seen a jurisdiction actually be able to overcome in total a comment from HCD. They can, I would say, negotiate components depending on the comment, just in regard, and I say negotiate, not in regards to, oh, well, we'll do this, but not this. It's not that type of negotiation. It's more like negotiating, showing this is the nexus of your question or your comment. Here's actually where a lot of our solutions that we actually provided in this, and bridging the gap of how do we further draw the nexus and create a more refined and defined program or policy, or even analysis of something. That's usually the fundamental thing that is kind of the overarching kind of issue, is a lot of times jurisdictions, especially until the 6th cycle, thought that it was optional. It's not optional. These are requirements. A lot of times HCD, and this kind of goes back to their comment letters in regards to how do you actually get things to be able to get not just adopted, because that's not really the precipice of what we have to do. We have to get certified, or at least be found to be in substantial compliance. Is we have to be able to bridge the gap of what our community wants and needs and what the state requires. And so that does take a lot of finessing. And so I think that's kind of the negotiation component of what we receive from HCD. Again, it's one of those things where they will use terms that say should in their comment letters. That might as well just say shall. So because they will deny it and keep it going back through the process and repeat their comment and say, you should do X, Y, and Z. So in my experience, we have been challenged in regards to, the community wanting to include certain things into the program that are inconsistent with state law. When they tell you that something's inconsistent, you kind of just have to accept the fact that they have the support of the Attorney General and the legal interpretation from the state level that's how they're determining the law to be read, in regards to if they tell you something's inconsistent. Another fundamental thing, which I think we have done good here, that I have seen an agency be denied for, is the meaningful engagement component. Thankfully, we are spatially a small city. The bigger spatially you are in regards to, from the left end to the right end of the city, we don't have that problem here. So it's been, I think, fairly easy to kind of keep the word going in regards to circulation through the town crier, through posts or the banners around town, obviously through electronic, publishing of documents and newsletters and things of that nature. But I have seen some underserved communities be denied just based on the fact that HCD did not find them to have had meaningful engagement as a part of their process, where they felt that there was a sector of the community that actually did not get the opportunity to provide their comments and insight. And so I am hoping that the state does find us to be satisfactory in that arena of our document. But again, they also could, if we have, and I'm not aware of any until this point, that says, you didn't talk to this section of the community, or, you didn't talk to us explicitly, even like, why didn't you, reach out to us? Why didn't we take, a small group meeting for this and, explain our needs, our wants? I have not received any correspondence like that up until this point. And my interim placement of a previous director that was here after the retirement of John Biggs, my predecessor, I have not received anything like that. So I'm hopeful that that has not been an issue in our community, but that's also another fundamental thing that I have seen agencies denied for or just sent back to the drawing board.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you, everybody, for your attendance. And Nick, thanks so much for a great presentation and a robust response to the questions that were asked. It really fleshed out what's been going on in a lot of people's heads in this fair city of ours about, there's a lot of confusion out there about what the housing element is, what it does, what it can do, et cetera. So we're just very much appreciate your coming today. And thank you again to everybody for attending. And we look forward to seeing everybody on the 29th. And we'll be posting this video onto our website. Please feel free to, take a look at it there. Have a great July 4th weekend, everybody.
Nick, David,
Thank you,
thanks a lot.
everyone. Have a good rest of your day.